The sun had barely risen over the glassy surface of the lake when Daniel steered their old pickup down the narrow gravel road that led to their cabin. It was their favorite place to escape, tucked away among tall pines, where the air was fresh. The water reflected the sky like a mirror, and the sound of the city felt like a distant memory. He glanced at his wife, Maria, in the passenger seat. She had her sunglasses on, hair tied back, and that calm but alert expression she always carried. Even though she was officially off duty for the weekend, she never stopped being aware of her surroundings. That's why her sidearm rested, as always, in its holster at her hip. It wasn't a show of force. It was habit. It was safety. They pulled into the small driveway beside the cabin, the tires crunching over loose stones. Daniel stepped out and stretched, breathing in the crisp morning air. Maria slid out of the passenger seat, her boots hitting the ground with a quiet thud. She reached into the truck bed to start unloading groceries, bags of fresh bread, vegetables, some meat for grilling, and a cooler packed with cold drinks. The scent of pine needles mixed with the faint smell of the lake carried on the breeze. Everything felt peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you want to sit on the porch all day and watch the water sparkle. But peace doesn't always last. Not when someone like Susan is around. They'd seen Susan before, though not often. She was one of those neighbors who seemed to have appointed herself the keeper of the community's rules. She always had something to say about the right way to park, the right way to trim trees, or even what color flower pots should be. Maria and Daniel usually ignored her and kept to themselves, but today it seemed they wouldn't get that luxury. Daniel noticed her before Maria did. Susan was about 50, with neatly curled hair and a permanent squint, as if she was always searching for something to disapprove of. She was wearing a bright floral blouse, and in her hand she clutched a clipboard, a sure sign that she was on duty for whatever neighborhood mission she'd assigned herself that day. She had been walking her little terrier along the gravel path, but as soon as she spotted Maria, her steps slowed. Her gaze dropped to Maria's hip, and her mouth tightened. Maria kept unloading bags, her movements steady, unaware that she had just become the center of Susan's attention. Daniel braced himself. He'd seen that look on Susan's face before, on other people too. It was the look of someone who had already decided they were right and was about to start a fight they didn't need to. Susan stopped at the edge of their driveway, holding her dog's leash taut. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that sharp, self-important tone that seemed to slice through the quiet morning air. Maria looked up, eyebrows slightly raised, polite but cautious. "Good morning," she replied. "That is not allowed here," Susan said, pointing directly at the holstered sidearm on Maria's hip. "This is a family community. We don't walk around with weapons out in the open." Maria glanced down at her holster, then back at Susan. Her voice stayed calm. "I'm a federal officer," she said evenly. "This is part of my standard equipment, even off duty. I'm fully licensed to carry." Susan's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew more determined. "I don't care what kind of license you have. It's dangerous. Children live here. You should lock that thing away before someone gets hurt." Daniel stepped closer, sensing the tension. She's not pointing it at anyone. She's not threatening anyone. It's just there, exactly where it's supposed to be, he said, his tone steady but firm. Susan's eyes narrowed further, the kind of look people get when they've already made up their mind. "I'm going to have to report this. People like you shouldn't be bringing that kind of thing around decent neighborhoods." Maria took a deep breath, refusing to let herself get drawn into an argument. "You're welcome to call whoever you need to," she replied, turning back toward the truck to grab the last grocery bag. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show irritation, just kept her calm, professional composure. But Susan wasn't satisfied. She lingered there a moment longer, her little dog pulling impatiently at the leash before spinning on her heel and walking briskly down the path toward her house. Daniel watched her go, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew exactly where she was headed. "Let me guess," he muttered to Maria. "She's calling the police." Maria gave the faintest shrug. "If she does, we'll handle it," she said simply. It wasn't that Maria didn't care, she just knew the law was on her side. She had spent years in situations where she had to keep her cool, even under pressure. Compared to some of the tense, unpredictable encounters she had faced in her line of work, this was just an inconvenience. Still, Daniel could see the way. Her eyes scanned the road now, alert to the possibility of patrol cars showing up. The peaceful morning had shifted. Birds still chirped in the distance. The breeze still moved through the trees. But there was a new undercurrent, one of waiting, of anticipation. Daniel finished carrying the groceries inside while Maria set up the small grill on the porch. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid began to drift through the air, but in the back of his mind, Daniel knew their quiet weekend had just taken an unexpected turn. He glanced toward the road again. No flashing lights yet, but he wouldn't be surprised to see them soon. He knew Susan well enough to guess that her version of the story wouldn't be accurate. She wouldn't say, "A neighbor was carrying her legally owned and licensed firearm while unloading groceries." She'd probably make it sound like Maria was pacing the property, waving it around. Inside the cabin, the refrigerator hummed as Daniel tucked away the groceries. Through the open window, he heard the faint sound of a screen door closing somewhere, down the lane, followed by muffled voices. Susan's sharp tone carried faintly on the breeze, though he couldn't make out the words. He imagined her on the phone, one hand gesturing wildly as if the dispatcher could see her. When he stepped back outside, Maria was leaning on the porch railing, looking out at the water. She didn't look angry, just thoughtful, as if she was deciding how she wanted to handle whatever was about to happen. She turned her head and met his eyes. "Whatever she says," Maria told him quietly. "We stay calm. No sudden moves. No raised voices. We let them see the truth for themselves." Daniel nodded. He trusted her judgment completely. In her career, she had faced far bigger challenges than a nosy neighbor with a phone. But still, he felt a simmering frustration. They had come here for peace, and instead, they were about to be pulled into someone else's drama. The lake glistened in the morning sun, as if nothing at all was out of place. But in the quiet, Daniel could almost hear the sound of tires crunching on gravel somewhere in the distance. It was only a matter of time before their weekend escape turned into something else entirely. And as he stood there beside Maria, he knew this was only the beginning. Daniel didn't have to guess long about what Susan was going to do. He could almost picture her in her tidy kitchen, yanking the phone off its cradle or snatching up her mobile with a determined frown. Maria had gone back to arranging things, on the porch, but Daniel's eyes kept drifting toward the road. Somewhere down there, behind those neat hedges, Susan's voice was probably spilling into a police dispatcher's ear. Inside her house, Susan paced back and forth as she spoke. In her mind, she was protecting her community. Her words were sharp, painting a picture far from the calm reality at Daniel and Maria's cabin. She told the dispatcher there was a woman openly carrying a firearm and made it sound like Maria was walking around making people nervous. She said she felt threatened and that children could be in danger. She didn't mention that Maria hadn't even spoken to anyone beyond a polite greeting. She didn't mention that the gun had stayed in its holster the whole time. Back at the cabin, Maria set the lighter aside and knelt to arrange charcoal in the small grill. Her movements were steady, practiced. She'd been through enough in her life to know that losing her composure now would help no one. Daniel stepped up beside her, handing her a pair of tongs, and tried to read her face. "You're sure you're okay with this?" he asked quietly. Maria gave the faintest smile. "Daniel, I've been through federal investigations, search warrants, and tense briefings with people twice my size glaring at me. This is just a neighbor who doesn't understand the law. She brushed a few crumbs from the grill grate, then looked up toward the trees. But make no mistake, when the police come, I'll be ready to explain myself. Daniel nodded, though his jaw was tight. He hated seeing her have to defend herself over something so ordinary. She wasn't breaking any laws. She wasn't even interacting with anyone other than him. But he knew how fast a false impression could snowball. About 15 minutes later, the quiet morning began to change. A bird startled from a branch and flew off. Then Daniel heard it, the faint hum of an engine in the distance growing louder. Tires crunched over gravel somewhere beyond the bend in the road. The hum became a rumble, and then the low crackle of a police radio floated faintly through the trees. "They're coming," Daniel said softly. Maria simply straightened her posture and wiped her hands on a towel. "Good. Let's get this over with." Down the road, 2 police cars came into view, moving slowly. The red and blue lights were off for now, but their presence alone was enough to make other neighbors peek out from behind curtains. Daniel saw a few heads turn, a couple of porch doors creak open. People whispered to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. Sure enough, before the patrol cars even reached the cabin, Susan was already outside. She waved one arm high in the air, signaling them down like she was directing traffic. Her little terrier barked at their feet, straining against its leash. The first officer rolled down his window to listen as Susan leaned in, her hands moving quickly as she talked. Daniel couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he didn't need to. He knew she was giving her version of events. Likely, painting Maria as some kind of dangerous intruder. One of the officers nodded slightly, his eyes scanning ahead toward the cabin. He pulled the patrol car forward, and the second car followed. They eased to a stop right in front of the driveway. Both doors opened, and the officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but watchful. Daniel's heart thumped harder, not because he feared what they'd find, but because he knew that moments like this could turn tense for no reason at all. He glanced at Maria, who looked calm, almost serene. She had her hands at her sides, not making any sudden movements. The taller of the 2 officers approached first, stopping a few feet away. "Morning, folks," he said in a steady voice. "We got a call about a possible disturbance and someone carrying a firearm." Maria nodded once, polite but direct. "That would be me. My name is Maria, and I'm a federal officer. I'm off duty, but I carry as part of my position. I'm fully licensed, and I'm on my own property." The officer's eyes flicked to the holstered sidearm at her hip, then back to her face. "Do you have identification with you?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Maria replied. She reached slowly toward her back pocket, making sure her movements were deliberate and clear. She pulled out her wallet and flipped it open, revealing both her driver's license and her federal badge. Daniel watched as the officer's expression shifted slightly, just enough to signal recognition. He took the badge gently, examined it, then handed it back with a nod. The second officer had been standing a few steps behind, observing the exchange. Now he stepped forward, a hint of a smile crossing his face. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "thank you for your service." Maria inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Just doing my job even when I'm not on the clock." Meanwhile, Susan stood at the edge of the driveway, looking confused. She'd clearly expected the officers to demand Maria hand over her firearm, maybe even ask her to leave. Instead, they were speaking to her like a colleague. One of the officers turned toward Susan. "Ma'am, there's no violation here. She's fully within her rights to carry on her property, and she's a law enforcement officer. There's nothing more for us to address." Susan opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. She looked from the officers to Maria, then back again, her cheeks turning slightly pink. The little terrier at her feet gave a sharp bark, as if impatient to move on. The officers didn't linger. They gave Maria and Daniel a courteous nod before returning to their patrol cars. Daniel let out a quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Maria stepped back toward the porch, the corner of her mouth lifting ever so slightly. Susan, on the other hand, retreated quickly down the road, her steps fast and her shoulders stiff. She didn't glance back. Daniel suspected she'd have a hard time explaining to the other neighbors why the dangerous woman she'd reported was now cooking lunch on her porch without a care in the world. Maria picked up the tongs again and returned to the grill, as if nothing had happened. "Well," she said softly, "that's one way to start a weekend." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "I guess peace and quiet looks different to some people." They went back to their morning, the lake stretching out calm and wide in front of them. But Daniel knew that somewhere in the neighborhood, Susan was replaying that moment in her head, the moment her call didn't go the way she'd imagined. The air around the cabin felt strangely still after the two police cars stopped at the edge of the driveway. The taller officer, with a calm but focused expression, stepped closer to Maria. Daniel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the kind of silence that seemed to magnify every small sound. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a boat engine on the lake, even the creak of the porch boards beneath Maria's boots. Susan stood to one side, just far enough back to let the officers take the lead, but close enough to hear every word. Her little terrier panted heavily at the end of its leash, its nails clicking impatiently on the gravel. Susan's arms were crossed, chin tilted up as though she was certain justice was about to be served in her favor. Maria, however, didn't fidget or glance nervously at Daniel. She simply waited for the officers to speak. Her stance was relaxed, but upright, her hands visible at her sides. The sunlight glinted off the small, badge-shaped imprint stitched into the leather of her holster. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we received a call from a concerned resident about someone carrying a visible firearm. Can you tell me your name and reason for having it?" "My name is Maria," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm a federal officer. I carry my service weapon on and off duty, as permitted by law. I'm here with my husband for the weekend on my own property." The officer gave a slight nod, studying her face. "May I see your identification?" "Of course," Maria replied. She reached slowly into her back pocket for her wallet. Daniel watched the movement, precise, deliberate. She flipped it open and held it so the officer could see both her driver's license and her badge. The badge caught the light, the polished metal gleaming in the morning sun. The officer's eyes flicked to it and lingered for a moment before looking back at Maria. Something subtle shifted in his demeanor. His posture eased just slightly, and his tone softened. "Understood," he said quietly, handing the wallet back to her. "Thank you for showing me." Behind him, the second officer stepped forward, curiosity in his eyes. He glanced at the badge, too, recognition flickering across his expression. Daniel saw it, that moment when the dots connected. These weren't just two strangers meeting. They were professionals speaking the same language, bonded by a mutual understanding of duty and risk. "You're in federal service?" the second officer asked, his voice respectful. "Yes," Maria confirmed. "Been in for over a decade." The second officer gave a small smile, then looked to his partner. "We're good here." But instead of turning away, the taller officer straightened to attention. His right hand rose in a crisp, practiced salute. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight, one trained professional acknowledging another. Daniel felt a quiet surge of pride in his chest. Maria didn't return the salute in the same way, but she gave a firm nod, her eyes steady. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, lowering his hand. "Thank you for your service. I know what it means to carry that badge, even on your own time. You're well within your rights here." Susan's head turned sharply, her mouth parting slightly. It was as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. her dangerous stranger being shown professional respect. The second officer stepped closer, his voice carrying a friendly tone now. "Do you need anything from us? Any trouble? With the area?" "No trouble," Maria replied. "Just enjoying some time away, though I think a misunderstanding got out of hand." The taller officer glanced toward Susan, who quickly shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "We spoke with the reporting party," he said tactfully. "It appears she was unaware of your position and the legality of your carry. There's no violation here." Susan opened her mouth as if to argue, but one look from the officer kept her silent. She looked down at her dog, pretending to adjust. The leash. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, watching the scene with a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. He knew Maria didn't carry her badge and weapon to impress anyone. They were tools of her work, symbols of her responsibility. But seeing the officers recognize that without her having to defend herself any further was something he appreciated deeply. The taller officer gave one final nod toward Maria. "We'll log this as a resolved misunderstanding. Enjoy your weekend." "Thank you," Maria replied sincerely. Both officers returned to their patrol cars, their manner relaxed now. The engines started with a low rumble, and they rolled slowly back down the gravel road. As they left, Daniel noticed one of them give a small wave toward the cabin. Maria raised her hand in acknowledgement. For a moment, the only sound was the breeze moving through the trees and the distant ripple of the lake's surface. Susan still stood there, looking as if she'd been left out of some important conversation. She muttered something under her breath, tugged on her dog's leash, and turned to walk away. Daniel waited until she was halfway down the road before speaking. "I don't think that went the way she thought it would." Maria gave a quiet chuckle. "Probably not." She turned back toward the grill, checking the charcoal. "But sometimes people need to see the truth for themselves before they stop making assumptions." Daniel stepped beside her, still feeling the adrenaline ebb from his body. He thought about the salute, about the way both officers had shifted their tone once they understood who Maria was. It wasn't about rank or power. It was about mutual respect, the kind that can't be faked. As the smoke from the grill drifted upward, curling lazily into the morning air, the cabin returned to its usual calm. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, and somewhere far across the water a loon called out. For Maria, the moment had already passed, just another encounter handled, with composure. For Daniel, it would linger, a reminder of who his wife was and how she carried herself no matter where she went. Somewhere in the neighborhood, Susan was probably replaying it all in her head, wondering if she'd made a mistake. And Daniel suspected that the next time she saw Maria, she might think twice before jumping to conclusions. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow across the lake and the surrounding trees. The calm of the weekend had returned to Daniel and Maria's cabin, but the events of the morning still hung in the air like an invisible weight. Daniel was arranging firewood near the cabin, stacking it neatly against the side, while Maria returned to preparing lunch on the porch grill. The scent of charcoal and sizzling vegetables filled the air, mixing with the fresh smell of the pine trees and the faint hint of water from the lake. Despite the ordinary scene, Daniel could sense that something had changed in the neighborhood. A few neighbors who had earlier peeked from behind curtains or across the street now seemed more hesitant, whispering to each other rather than acting boldly. Susan, the neighbor who had called the police, had disappeared from view, likely retreating to her house to rethink her actions. Daniel and Maria had no intention of making a spectacle, but the morning's events had left a mark. Maria glanced over at Daniel as he stacked the last piece of firewood. "You know," she said, her voice calm but tinged with amusement, "I don't think she expected us to handle that so calmly, or the officers to react the way they did." Daniel chuckled. "I think she expected a lot more drama, maybe even an argument or confrontation. Instead, she got respect." He paused, letting the word sink in. Not the respect she was hoping for, though. Maria smiled faintly, turning her attention back to the grill. Respect is what comes from knowing the law, knowing your rights, and keeping your composure. It's not about who shouts the loudest. As she spoke, Daniel noticed movement down the road. A few of the neighbors who had been watching earlier were now walking closer to the cabin, curiosity outweighing hesitation. One of them, a middle-aged man with a fishing hat, stopped near the edge of the property, giving a polite wave. "Hey there," he called out. "Sorry about this morning. We didn't realize what was really going on." Maria looked up, her expression calm and welcoming. "No worries," she said. "Misunderstandings happen. We're all neighbors here after all." Daniel felt a sense of relief wash over him. The tension of the morning was slowly easing, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of community. The neighbors, seeing how the officers had handled the situation and how Maria had presented herself, seemed to be reconsidering their own assumptions. As the grill continued to sizzle, Maria placed the finished vegetables onto a platter and stepped inside the cabin to fetch plates. Daniel followed, carrying a couple of bottles of water. They moved with ease, the rhythm of their life at the lake cabin uninterrupted despite the earlier drama. When Maria returned with the plates, the first neighbor had moved closer, and now a small group had gathered, each person offering polite smiles and tentative greetings. "We just wanted to say, we saw how the officers treated you," one woman said, her voice slightly nervous. "It was impressive." Maria nodded, accepting the compliment gracefully. "Thank you," she said. "But it's not about impressing anyone. It's about doing the right thing and staying calm, even when someone misunderstands the situation." Daniel noticed Susan peeking from behind her fence further down the street. She hadn't come close, but her eyes followed every movement. The woman's expression was a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and something Daniel suspected was growing respect. He could almost see the thought forming in her mind. Maybe she had misjudged Maria. "Looks like she's realizing the truth," Daniel whispered to Maria, a hint of a smile on his face. Maria didn't respond immediately. She set the plates on the porch table and looked out toward the street, her eyes following Susan's gaze. "Maybe," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes a little time for people to see reality. They need to experience it firsthand and then reflect on their own actions." The neighbors lingered, their initial nervousness slowly giving way to genuine conversation. One of the men spoke up, asking about the cabin, the lake, and how Daniel and Maria spent their weekends. Maria answered with warmth, sharing small stories about fishing trips, hikes in the surrounding woods, and quiet mornings like this one. Daniel joined in, offering his own anecdotes about the wildlife and the peacefulness of the area. The conversation was simple, ordinary, but it carried a powerful message. The neighbors were seeing Maria not as a threat, but as a person, someone capable, composed, and undeniably skilled in her profession. They were witnessing the kind of respect that comes naturally to those who act with integrity, and they were reconsidering their earlier assumptions. Meanwhile, Susan stayed at the edge of her property, still hidden but no longer as assertive. She tugged at her dog's leash and muttered to herself, pacing in a small circle. Daniel noticed that she wasn't yelling or waving her arms anymore. She was quietly processing what had happened. Maria noticed Susan too, but she didn't let it disturb her. She continued serving plates and pouring drinks for the neighbors who had gathered, her actions calm and deliberate. Daniel could see how her quiet confidence influenced everyone around her. Even Susan, despite herself, seemed to take notice. "Maybe she's learning a lesson," Daniel said quietly, watching Susan glance over at the porch one more time before retreating toward her own house. "Maybe," Maria agreed, "or maybe she just needs time. Either way, the situation is under control now." As the group of neighbors continued chatting with Daniel and Maria, The atmosphere shifted from awkward tension to a genuine sense of connection. People laughed at small jokes, shared tips about the lake and the surrounding trails, and asked questions about life in general. The fear or suspicion that had motivated Susan's call seemed to dissipate with every word, replaced by curiosity and respect. Daniel looked around and realized that the morning's incident had unexpectedly strengthened their position in the community. What could have been a long, stressful confrontation had turned into an opportunity to demonstrate composure, knowledge, and integrity. Maria had handled it with quiet authority, and the neighbors had seen that firsthand. Even the children in the neighborhood, who had earlier been peeking from behind windows, now began to approach cautiously. Maria greeted them with a smile, asking if they had been swimming or exploring the woods nearby. She listened attentively as they told her about their morning adventures, showing interest and patience. Daniel noted how the simple act of kindness and attention changed their demeanor. They were no longer timid or hesitant. By mid-afternoon, Susan had retreated entirely behind her fence. Daniel suspected she was reflecting on the morning's events, maybe reconsidering the assumptions she had made in haste. He didn't think she would approach them directly anytime soon, but he also knew that her attitude toward Maria and their cabin had shifted subtly. Maria, meanwhile, had returned to the porch to relax with a cup of iced tea. Daniel joined her, setting his own drink down. "You handled that beautifully," he said quietly. Maria smiled, but it was modest, almost unassuming. "I didn't have to do anything special. Just stay calm, follow the law, and be honest about who I am. The rest takes care of itself." Daniel nodded, feeling a sense of pride and relief. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the gentle waves reflecting light across the cabin's porch. It was a perfect day, and despite the morning's tension, everything had returned to a peaceful rhythm. The neighborhood had seen how respect and professionalism could diffuse a tense situation, and the gossip and whispers that had begun earlier in the day now carried a different tone. Instead of exaggerating danger, they acknowledged the truth. Maria had handled herself with skill and dignity, and the officers had recognized that immediately. For Daniel, it was a quiet but profound lesson. Respect, he realized, wasn't about asserting dominance or making someone fear you. It was about demonstrating knowledge, composure, and integrity. When others saw that, their own judgments shifted naturally, often faster than words or arguments could achieve. The rest of the afternoon passed in calm, quiet enjoyment. Daniel and Maria shared stories, laughter, and the simple pleasure of the lake. The neighbors drifted away slowly, each returning to their own homes with a new perspective. Even Susan, though still distant, was left with the undeniable evidence of how capable and respected Maria truly was. By the time the sun began to dip low over the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin and the lake, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The day that had begun with tension, misunderstanding, and the threat of conflict had ended with quiet dignity, respect, and community connection. Maria leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea. "It's been an interesting day," she said, with a soft laugh. Daniel reached across the table, taking her hand. "Interesting doesn't even begin to cover it," he said. Together, they watched the sun reflect off the water, knowing that whatever challenges came next, they would face them with calm, composure, and the quiet strength that had carried them through the morning. The lake remained serene, the trees stood tall, and the cabin had once again become a place of peace, connection, and quiet triumph. The evening settled softly over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and deep orange. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying the scent of pine and the faint aroma of the grill from earlier. Daniel and Maria sat on the porch, their chairs pulled close together, enjoying the quiet peace that had returned to their cabin. After the tension-filled morning and the afternoon's lessons in patience and respect, the world felt calm once more. Daniel leaned back, taking in the view of the still water and the distant silhouette of a canoe gliding across the lake. He could hear the soft chirping of crickets beginning to rise in the trees and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. It was a comforting sound, the kind that reminded him why he loved this place. Maria, sipping her tea, let her eyes wander across the landscape with a serene smile. "This week has been something else," Daniel said, breaking the quiet. Maria chuckled softly. "You're not wrong," she replied. "But it's been a good something else. We handled it, calmly, wisely, and with patience." Daniel nodded, his gaze lingering on the horizon. He thought about Susan, the neighbor who had caused so much tension earlier in the day. He wondered what she was thinking now. Maria had handled the situation with incredible composure, and Daniel knew Susan couldn't ignore that. As if on cue, movement caught his eye across the street. Susan appeared at the edge of her property, standing quietly and watching the cabin. She wasn't yelling or gesturing this time. She simply observed, her dog at her side, both of them calm. Daniel noticed something in her posture, a slight slump in her shoulders, a gesture that seemed like reflection, maybe even a bit of remorse. "Look at her," Daniel said softly to Maria. "I think she's realizing she made a mistake." Maria nodded, her eyes warm but steady. "People need to see the truth for themselves. Sometimes it takes a moment, sometimes it takes hours, but eventually, most do." Susan didn't move closer. She stayed at a safe distance, perhaps still, uncertain. But there was no anger in her eyes, no accusations, just observation. Daniel realized that for her, the morning's events had left a lasting impression. She had seen firsthand that Maria wasn't just any neighbor. She was someone composed, skilled, and deserving of respect. Inside the cabin, Maria was preparing some snacks for the evening, arranging fresh fruit and cheese on a small plate. Daniel came in to help, and together they set the tray on the porch table. The soft light of the setting sun reflected off the glass of water and the polished wood, creating a peaceful golden glow. "Do you think she'll come over?" Daniel asked quietly. Maria shook her head slightly. "Not today. But she's thinking, and that's what matters. Change doesn't happen in a single moment, but reflection is the first step." Daniel smiled, appreciating Maria's patience. He had watched her all day, handling neighbors, officers, and even the tension in the community with grace. She had a way of making people see the truth without raising her voice or demanding attention. It was subtle, quiet power. Power that came from confidence and integrity. As the sun dipped lower, the sounds of the neighborhood shifted. Windows opened, and families began their evening routines. Laughter and conversation floated softly in the air. Even the neighbors who had been quietly observing earlier seemed to carry a newfound respect. It was as if the day had reset the balance in the community. Maria and Daniel settled into their chairs with the tray of snacks between them. They ate slowly, savoring the quiet, sharing small smiles and stories about past trips to the lake, hikes through the woods, and evenings like this. 1. The warmth of the setting sun, the gentle breeze, and the calm water all contributed to a sense of contentment that Daniel had rarely felt so strongly. Daniel glanced at the street once more. Susan was gone, retreating into her house, but Daniel felt confident that the events of the day had left a lasting impression. She would remember the officer's respect, Maria's composure, and the quiet dignity with which the situation had been handled. Perhaps she would rethink her assumptions about neighbors, or at least approach the future with more caution and consideration. Maria reached out and took Daniel's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You know," she said, her voice calm, "it's days like this that remind me why patience and understanding are so important. People often react out of fear or misunderstanding. Our job is to handle it with calm and let them see the truth." Daniel nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride and gratitude. "I've seen that today. You made everyone see it, even Susan. She may not admit it out loud, but she knows the truth now." As the sun finally slipped behind the trees, leaving the lake bathed in soft twilight, Daniel and Maria sat in comfortable silence. They listened to the sounds of the evening, the rustling leaves, the occasional call of a bird settling for the night, and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. It was a peaceful melody, one that seemed to signal closure and a new beginning. Later, as darkness settled in fully, the cabin lights cast a warm glow across the porch. Daniel and Maria lit a small lantern, placing it on the table to provide soft illumination. The lake reflected the stars beginning to appear in the sky, each one twinkling like a distant promise. Daniel looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The day had started with tension, fear, and misunderstanding, but it had ended with peace, reflection, and respect. He realized that these moments, though challenging, were opportunities to show character, patience, and understanding. Maria had taught him, and the neighborhood had witnessed, that composure and integrity could turn potential conflict into a lesson for everyone. Maria broke the quiet, her eyes reflecting the lantern's light. "Tomorrow we'll have more neighbors, stopping by, asking questions, maybe even apologizing for misunderstandings. But we'll handle it the same way, calm, patient, and respectful." Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "And it'll work," he said, "because truth and respect always show themselves." They shared a quiet laugh, a simple moment of joy after a day full of tension and lessons. The cabin, the lake, and the surrounding trees seemed to hold their own quiet approval, the peaceful night wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. As they prepared for the night, Daniel reflected on everything that had happened. The officer's salute, the neighbors' reactions, Susan's retreat, all these moments were reminders of the power of integrity and patience. Even a challenging situation, approached with calm and understanding, could become a moment of teaching and connection. The stars grew brighter overhead, mirrored by the gentle sparkle of the lake below. Daniel and Maria settled into their evening routine, feeling a quiet contentment that only came from knowing they had acted with honor, courage, and patience. In the distance, the night air carried the soft sounds of the neighborhood, the rustling of leaves, the occasional laughter, and the quiet murmur of life continuing. Daniel and Maria knew that their weekend at the lake cabin had become more than just a retreat. It had become a demonstration of calm strength, quiet dignity, and the respect that comes from living honestly and with integrity. As they turned in for the night, the cabin was silent, but alive with a sense of peace and accomplishment. They had faced tension, misunderstanding, and even fear, but they had navigated it all with composure. The neighborhood would remember the day, and Daniel and Maria would carry the lesson with them, that respect, patience, and truth always have the power to transform even the most challenging moments. The lake reflected the moonlight, shimmering gently like silver across the calm water. Daniel and Maria sat side by side, their hands intertwined, hearts full with quiet satisfaction. The cabin, the lake, and the community around them had witnessed a story of composure and integrity, and the night held the promise of more peaceful days ahead. With the stars above and the quiet of the lake surrounding them, Daniel realized one thing clearly. The day had been a reminder that calm strength and integrity could change perceptions, mend misunderstandings, and create lasting respect in ways that nothing else could. And with Maria by his side, he knew they could face anything the world threw at them, together, with grace and patience. The evening passed, peaceful and gentle, carrying them into a quiet night filled with reflection, contentment, and the knowledge that even the most difficult moments could become lessons in patience, respect, and understanding.